Hello, everyone, and welcome to our briefing on the possibilities for future ownership and governance models for Lough Neagh. I'm very appreciative of your time, and we'll take about 90 minutes altogether. And first of all, my name is Peter Doran. I'm based at the School of Law. I've invited a number of professional colleagues to offer their initial thoughts on how the rights of Lough Neagh could be incorporated into future governance and ownership arrangements. These are the thoughts of my colleagues at the Earth Law Centre, the Centre for Democratic and Environmental Rights, Lawyers for Nature. Their offerings for you, the campaigners and decision makers. We're in no way suggesting that these are definitive proposals. What we'd like to do is treat today's session as a kind of research in progress opportunity. This is a typical academic approach where we're checking in with key stakeholders and interested individuals and organizations with some ideas and inviting you to feedback. You can do that today as part of the briefing session, but we'll also invite you to put your comments in writing so that your views can be incorporated and reflected in a final document that will be published around Easter time. We'll also be recording today's session, so just to bear that in mind, and hopefully we have your permission to do that. It makes it easier, obviously, to capture all of the conversations. With that, I'd like to hand over to Grant Wilson from the Earth Law Centre. Grant.
Thank you so much, Peter, and to everyone. It's such an honor to be here. I'll just give some very quick remarks, and then we're going to go through some details of our research. But I want to take a second to acknowledge how special this meeting is. We are looking at Earth-centered legal structures that have the potential to really change and respect our relationship with nature. And this is part of a global movement to rewild the law, to create legal structures in harmony with nature that is emerging across the world. And having this conversation here is not only about the rights of Lough Neagh or legal structures to give Lough Neagh a voice, but also about creating a movement of future leaders who are going to learn about this project in your region and become inspired and get involved and continue to bring innovation. So it's something concrete right in front of us here today, but it is also part of this much larger movement that's expanding all over the globe that I'll talk about shortly. And I also want you to keep in mind throughout this presentation, while you should definitely be inspired by what's happening all over the world, I also believe it's so important to keep these legal structures rooted in cultural community connections to ecosystems, to bioregionalism and bioculturalism. Humans are part of nature. The folks who live around Lough Neagh are part of the lough. And it's important to keep this in mind as we're looking at some of these legal innovations. Lastly, I just want to say that the folks you have in the room today are the best of the best in rights of nature, earth-centered legal movements, both in your region and across the world. And so it's just a really special opportunity to pick the brains of leading experts in this space. So it's an honor to be here with everyone I'll share the floor with today. And I think that's enough for just some quick opening remarks. Peter, can you pass it along to the next on the agenda, please?
And our next speaker is Margil, who's a real friend of the movement here on the island of Ireland. It was Murray and Thomas Lindsay, senior counsel at the Centre for Democratic and Environmental Rights, who helped kick off the movement, and their intervention, sponsored by Friends of the Earth in Northern Ireland, led directly to some of the motions that went through a number of councils across the island, recognizing and kicking off consultations on the incorporation of the rights of nature at local government level. Mari, can I invite you to say a few words? Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we have a situation here, don't we, with Lough Neagh. You know, for all the time that we've been working in Northern Ireland as well as Ireland, I think Lough Neagh really captures everything that's going wrong around the world in terms of human relationship with the natural world. And it's such a tragedy, what's happening. And I think it also provides a tremendous opportunity. When we first created the Rights of Nature model over 15 years ago, we studied the failure of environmental law to protect the environment. We looked at the failure to consider a status and protection for nature that was truly protective. And we looked at the failure of how environmental laws fail to protect the people or empower people who are experiencing harm to the natural world by having those people who live within and are part of an ecosystem disempowered from being able to protect that ecosystem, and who experience the harm to that ecosystem more than anyone else, and yet had the least amount of authority to actually protect it. And we found this everywhere in the world that we've worked, beginning in the United States, but then in Ecuador and Australia and Nepal and India, and again, back in Northern Ireland, where we've been working with Friends of the Earth Northern Ireland and other partners for a long time. And everywhere we've worked, we see the same pattern repeated. Those who are living within the ecosystem, who are the ones most harmed when that ecosystem is harmed, are also the ones with the least power to stop that harm, to protect the ecosystem. Decisions are made by people whose interests are not the interests of the people or the ecosystem within which they live. And so when we developed the Rights of Nature model to recognize that nature itself possesses rights to health and well-being, and in the case of Lough Neagh, the idea of having the most basic right of all, the right to exist, comes into, I think, stark relief, because the health of the lough is in such dire straits. And so the Rights of Nature model is intended to both protect the rights of ecosystems and species and all of nature, but also the people who live closest to an ecosystem or a species, and empower people to actually have the legally enforceable right to protect those ecosystems when harmed. And so we have, in our experience working with different communities within Northern Ireland, what we have seen, of course, is that it's people on the ground in communities in different districts who have been the ones on the front lines stopping and preventing things like gold mining and fossil fuel infrastructure and industrial farming. They have always been the ones who have driven that change and built the pressure for change and demanded change. And that continues to today. And I know that they're exhausted. They've been doing it for so long because the law is not in their favor. And I think that Lough Neagh presents an opportunity to change that. And much like, you know, I live in America, and the Northern Ireland peace process has been one of a tremendous model of long sought and long fought, of course, but it's been a model for how real change and meaningful change is possible. And I think where we are today in our current world, where we have overlapping environmental global crises, climate change, species decline. I know that, you know, there are recent reports that there's been bird decline around the Lough Neagh, for instance. I mean, all of these things are happening, and Lough Neagh provides a microcosm of everything that's been going wrong. I think that Northern Ireland, and with Lough Neagh, has an opportunity to create another model, to be a leader once again, extending the peace process, if you will, to finally, within industrial nations, with our current relationship with the natural world, which is one of use and extraction, in which we treat the natural world essentially as literally a natural resource for humans to use, that we have a model to change what that looks like. And it's a model to extend peace, and that is peace between humans and nature. And that to me means that because of all of the work and all of the organizing and advocacy at the grassroots, at the community level within Northern Ireland around mining and fossil fuels and so on, it's very clear that that's where the change gets made, and that a democratic process is needed for Lough Neagh now, in my opinion, which is very much of and by the people of Northern Ireland, developed by them, defined by them, and rooted within them such that they are empowered. And truthfully, nothing short of binding law, that is recognizing within enforceable binding law at the district council level, at the central government level, and even beyond, to recognize rights of the lough to be healthy and have well-being, as well as recognizing the rights of the people of Northern Ireland to a healthy lough and clean water and clean drinking water that comes from all of that. That nothing short of binding law is going to be able to provide the legal status and the enforceability that's needed to protect this lough. And I think it provides a real model for what's possible as we humans finally recognize that we are part of nature, that we depend on nature. And that's the work that we have been doing in different parts of the world. And rights of nature laws are now in local communities, national governments, and even in Ecuador's constitution, where we worked back in 2008. And it's elevating the status of nature, it's elevating the protection of nature, and critically, it's empowering people who live within ecosystems to protect those ecosystems. I think nothing short of that will accomplish what I think we all here want to accomplish with the lough, which is to restore it, but also to restore to the people the ability to protect this place. So with that said, I think that means legislation. I know that's how difficult, but moving that forward so that people have the ability to do that. And the lough has finally the opportunity to have its rights recognized and be protected. So I'll stop there, but I appreciate this conversation, but really believe this has to be a democratic process. Everywhere we've worked, it's establishing a democratic authority for people, empowering them to protect the places where they live. That becomes the crucial factor in being able to protect those places. So this is as much about democratic rights and community rights as it is about the rights of the lough. Those two things are integral. They go hand in hand. You're not going to have one successfully without the other. And so that's really the work we've done. And working with our partners in Northern Ireland, we've had district councils establishing resolutions on rights of nature, including rights of the lough, recognizing the rights of the lough. That work, I think, very much needs to continue, and moving those into binding laws is really where we see that we can be helpful. And so I hope that that can move forward, a democratic process to empower the people of Northern Ireland and the lough itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you for all of your contribution to building the movement across the island. You played an amazing role on the campaign around the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity in Dublin and in shepherding those recommendations through the Irish parliamentary system as well. And we appreciate your allyship and your solidarity throughout that campaign. I think we're now going to move back to Grant for a few more thoughts on the global movement. Is that correct? Oh, Paul, sorry.
Oh, no, I think I'm up next. Thanks so much. And Mari, thank you for all the incredible work over many years across the globe and in Northern Ireland. I'm just going to give a quick broad picture of the global rights of nature movement and also the global earth-centered or ecocentric legal movement And just to quickly say a bit more about myself, I've been working in this space the past 12 years or so. Went straight from law school into Rights of Nature, which 12 years later, I feel like I just hit the jackpot. I co-authored a book called Earth Law, Emerging Ecocentric Law, a guide for practitioners that has taught upwards of 1,000 lawyers and judges and advocates about Earth-centered legal movements, including the rights of nature. And so I've seen a lot of exciting progress over the years across the globe. But real quick, just to say a few things about the rights of nature for folks who maybe would like a little more background. Just a few of the basic tenets of the rights of nature that are important are one, humans and nature are not separate. Humans are not superior to nature. Rather, we are all part of this larger interconnected web of life. And what if the law reflected that? That's sort of what rights of nature does. Additionally, rights of nature is a move away from sort of damage control or emergency room type environmental laws that prevent ecosystems from totally collapsing, we hope, but don't achieve too often this goal of restoration of healthy interconnected ecosystems. And that is the goal of the rights of nature. And lastly, of course, the rights of nature acknowledges nature is not just mere property or a thing. It has rights and intrinsic value of its own. And these concepts have been proliferating rapidly across the world, beginning about 15 years ago in its modern state, and especially the last 5 years has been hockey stick growth, and it's really amazing. So more than 30 countries have some type of rights of nature legislation or eco-centric legislation, whether at the national or subnational level. I'm just going to highlight a few. Latin America is really the heart of the ecocentric law movement. In Peru last year, the Marañón River, which flows into the Amazon, was given its own legal rights. And beyond that, the traditional indigenous woman river defenders who have long spoken for this river culturally were amongst the legal guardians who speak legally for the river after this landmark court decision in Peru. We see Ecuador, constitutional court cases happening all the time to uphold the rights of nature, a cloud forest's rights being defended in court and it being given a voice. We see in Colombia, again, traditional river defenders being appointed as guardians of the Atrato River as part of a landmark case to uphold its rights. And this is a youth movement as well. It's such a good way to involve youth in the future of the environment. In Panama, it was a young lawmaker, a 26-year-old Juan Diego Vasquez Gutierrez, and a young scientist, Callie Wielenturf, working with young lawyers at Earth Law Center on a national rights of nature law that has been put into place to protect sea turtles and other imperiled ecosystems and species. And across the world, you can look at almost any region and see this bubbling up of earth-centered law that's just so inspiring. In Bangladesh, the rights of the Turag River and all rivers. In India, the rights of the animal kingdom in Uttarakhand, the state of Uttarakhand. And near you, we see in Spain rights of Mar Menor and legal guardianship for Mar Menor, a saltwater lagoon, not only legislated but upheld by Spain's constitutional court just this year. Lastly, in Oceania, we see rights of the Wanganui River, a rather personhood for the Wanganui River, and this understanding from the Wanganui River, the Wanganui Iwi, the Maori people, that I am the river and the river is me. They are inseparable from the identity of the river itself. And all these examples, which is just a taste, are part of this larger movement to harmonize human laws with the laws of nature, because our laws are so out of alignment with nature's natural rhythms. And even outside of the rights of nature, we see corporate law innovations to give nature a voice and its own agency in corporate settings. We see movements to consider nature as a family member or kin, because many people believe nature to be a relative, and using family law to protect nature. We see the criminalization of ecocide, the widespread destruction of nature. And we see legislative changes to create bioregional structures that better protect ecosystems, of which we are one small part. So if any of those little case studies were interesting to you, check them out online. There's a great site called the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor that has all of the ecocentric laws developing across the world. It's really fun to poke around, and feel free to watch to ask any questions about specific places. But again, this is all inspiration for you as you consider what it means to give nature a voice in your own region and based on your own cultural connection to ecosystems, including Lough Neagh. And I believe now we're going to turn it over to Paul Pousland to talk a little bit about the United Kingdom. So, Paul, and Peter, go ahead if you'd like to introduce Paul first, but over to you.
Yeah, I'm just going to say Paul is another great friend of the movement here on the island. We're looking forward to hearing his comments. Just one follow-up, Grant, you'll be interested, and everyone will be interested to know that there's an emerging connection with the River Guardians in Colombia. We're expecting to put together a visit by the River Guardians to Ireland sometime this year, with the support of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Dublin. So that's a very interesting connection because it's very much in the context of post-conflict and the recognition of the landscape as a victim of the conflict. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I'm Paul Pousland. I'm the co-founder of Lawyers for Nature and a barrister based in London, where I do various cases to try and protect and restore the natural world. I'm also the guardian of the River Roding in London, which has almost as many problems, dare I say it, as the Lough, all of them really stemming from our current failure of our environmental and regulatory system. And that failure of that environmental and regulatory system is not a coincidence, because Grant's just outlined these amazing developments around the world for rights of nature. But in many ways, the idea that is causing the destruction of nature and the earth all around the world, there's a strong claim that it originated first heavily in the United Kingdom. This idea of nature as mere property, as a dead resource to be extracted for human ends, really in some ways started here. And I also really believe that it's important to end it here as well, if we're going to have an impact on a worldwide scale for nature. But that obviously is very difficult politically, because the idea of nature as a dead resource is so entrenched here that it is going to be difficult to get legal changes passed either through the Westminster Parliament or through any of the devolved parliaments in the United Kingdom. Obviously, there's more success in Ireland with the constitutional changes that are proposed there, but the United Kingdom, it's very difficult. The closest we're coming to is sort of things on a local level. So there have been various bylaws proposed for rivers. One for the River Froom was rejected by central government a few years ago, and there's one being drafted for the River Ouse in Lewis, which again, we'll see how far that gets. But actually, obviously, that's at a very local level, and it's great, but the chances of us having a parliamentary intervention at either Westminster or devolved is unlikely at the moment. And so therefore we need to look at voluntary measures. What can we do to try and bring about rights of nature in the here and now as best we can using all the tools we have? And there's some amazing work going on, from interspecies councils being held now with government funding to actually imagine people speaking for different parts of nature. There's the Nature on the Board project, where companies have been voluntarily putting nature as a director onto their boards in the United Kingdom. There is also that project being extended to charities and third sector organisations, so nature trustees. And there's also amazing work around declarations of rights of nature. So this is just local people, often campaigners and river guardians or tree guardians, just making a declaration that they believe that nature has rights, and they will do whatever they peacefully can to uphold those rights. And of course, that has no legal impact whatsoever in a sense, but can have a massive impact. I've declared it myself on my river, and my river is substantially more protected now because of that declaration and the way that I act upon it. We can also put nature's voice voluntarily on bodies. So hopefully on my river, it's going to be the first river in the United Kingdom to have the voice of the river put onto the local catchment partnership, which is effectively the main decision-making body for the river that exists, such as it is in the current time. So that's the context that we see what is being proposed for Lough Neagh. And there's a particularly important voluntary adoption of rights of nature here, and that is by landowners or those who control land voluntarily taking on a rights of nature perspective in their ownership, or ideally handing over ownership to nature. And there has already been many different inquiries across the country of forward-thinking, enlightened landowners who want to move into a rights of nature way of relating to their land. For instance, I own a piece of river on the River Medway that I want to gift self-ownership, but we don't really, or haven't had the tools thus far to do that. And so this project is going to be, I think, amazing for inspiring other landowners to do similar, to start voluntarily adopting rights of nature, and most crucially, giving them the legal tools to go and do that. And I predict that there will be at least dozens, if not hundreds, of different interventions over the coming years that will adopt some of the tools that you're going to see today to voluntarily give rights of nature to various parts of nature in the UK. Finally, as well, to go back to the start about this issue of the possibility of legislative intervention, I said it was unlikely. That's unlikely at a Westminster level, but I do really believe that the magnitude of what is being proposed for Lough Neagh could help to unlock legislative change at Stormont, potentially even Westminster, to actually use legislation to craft a way forward for the Lough. And if that could be achieved, it would be an amazing thing for rights of nature across the UK, Ireland, and Europe. Because if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. And I think that's a really important message to take through today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. We now move to Pooja Sharma of the Earth Law Centre for a look at some of the corporate law innovations, a little overview. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I first want to just express gratitude for having the opportunity to share the work about Earth Law Centre, about nature governance with everyone. I learned very recently about the history behind the lake and the Irish culture, and it's very clear that there's a deep recognition and celebration of the inherent rights of nature and the beauty and ecological integrity. So it's really such a privilege to be here and share our work further to really amplify that mission and protect the lake further. So the work of nature governance is focused basically on bringing nature within organizations. So integrating nature's voice within corporations and businesses and seeing how that looks like in practice. We've identified 4 different pathways that Paul had mentioned earlier. Nature as purpose, nature as shareholder, nature as advisor, and nature as director. In all 4 of these pathways, we use private law to incentivize and integrate nature's voice within constitutional documents to make sure that nature's voice and speaking for nature and acting in the best interest of nature is integrated and codified within the organization itself. And the reason why we're bringing nature governance and sharing it as an opportunity in protecting the rights of the lake now is because we recognize that speaking for nature is not just a one-person job, but would involve a democratic process, as was mentioned earlier, and where stakeholders of different variety, whether it's one stakeholder, a group of stakeholders who can speak for the lake and really integrate the community's interest in preserving the ecological integrity for the lake and for the land. To have a voice represented, to have a voice represent nature within the model, the new model, whichever pathway is taken, is really important to not only recognize the relationality and the respect of the lake, but also to preserve the history for future generations as well. Giving a voice to nature, giving a voice to the stakeholders really integrates the beauty and the history that is of the land and of the lake itself. And lastly, what I'm going to just quickly share is we discussed this in further detail in the memo, but in order for to have an individual speak for nature, they would either take a guardian role, like Paul has done for the river, or an agential role. The memo goes into further detail as to the differences behind a guardian and agent, but ultimately, the end result is very similar in the fact that nature's voice is protected and it is integrated through a legal mechanism as well as a democratic process as well. I'm going to now pass it along to Kate, who will get into the finer details of that legal transfer ownership.
Great, thank you, Pooja. Hello, everybody. I'm Kate Chan. I am a pro bono counsel to the Rights of Lough Centre, and I am a corporate lawyer at the London office of Pillsbury Law. It is an American law firm that focuses on innovative legal topics like ESG, energy transition, and generally on legally innovative projects. So I've been supporting the ELC team, particularly on the Nature on a Board movement. And Pooja is also like a part of the team, so we have been working in that project as well. So this is a fascinating project because there are actually a lot of ways to use law as a tool to give Lough Neagh a voice and to provide a platform for different stakeholders in the community to contribute to the restoration and preservation cause. And there are a number of pathways proposed here, and I would give a general idea of each pathway, and they might involve some legally technical details, and we welcome any questions after the webinar, and we can answer those more legally technical questions. So the first pathway we want to go through is option 1, which is the community development trust option. So this is basically is our elaboration on the current proposal, the current approach proposed by the Lough Neagh Development Trust. We understand that generally the proposal means that emphasis that the current owner of Lough Neagh will transfer the interest in the land to a newly formed entity called the Community Development Trust, so that, as I call the CDT, will hold the legal title and ownership of Lough Neagh. So therefore, we think that the CDT would probably be a passive owner. And then the current proposal also mentions that the CDT would enter into a private contract with a new management company. We call it here Management Co, MGMT Co. And this management company will have the contractual obligations to manage the preservation and restoration of Lough Neagh. So we, as we detailed in the memo as well, we further elaborate on some key implementation steps on how this management contractual approach would be implemented. So firstly, the management company would be incorporated in a form of a company limited by guarantee. It is a very common corporate form for nonprofit organizations in UK. For example, like trade association usually uses this type of incorporation form. And we will draft the constitutional document of this management company to incorporate a community-based approach to the governance. So, for example, the membership of this management company can be divided into different membership classes so that they can represent the interests of various stakeholder groups. And the governance of the management company would be primarily led by board of directors. So board of directors of this company would be responsible for the day-to-day operational decision of the management company. And if desirable, because we use private law as a tool, we can always incorporate, for example, an advisory board that is sits above the board of directors, and it will provide strategic advice and retain some veto rights over major decisions of the management company, and that would ensure that no major decision can be undertaken without broad consent of all stakeholders. And one key note here about this approach is it is a contractual approach, meaning that the enforceability of the rights and obligations of the management company is entirely rooted in contract law. So it is private contract law, and therefore it is not an obligation provided by law or by another type of law, for example, trust law. So in comparison, this option might not be that protective when we compare with the other options. But of course, because it's rooted by contract law, so you would also get higher degree of flexibility. So that would be an implication of this option. So let's move on to the second option. That this option is what we propose, but actually it has a lot of overlaps with the option one. So this option also grounded in private law, but in private company law. So we emphasize that the legal title, the ownership of Lough Neagh, will be transferred to a new company called the Rights of Nature Trust. So this company would be a charitable trust company. And the reason for doing this is because it would be able to recognize natural entities like the ecosystems, the water bodies, like intrinsic rights of nature. So if you look at option one, it would be a contractual body that is entirely the basis of that would be in contract law. But if we look at option two, because it's grounded in company law, we are, because of the legal entity, the nature of the legal entity itself, we'd be able to do much more. So, for example, the Rights of Nature Trust can either be a registered charity, like an example would be a Woodland Trust, which is a charity, but at the same time, it is like a private company registered with the government. And the second option would be a nonprofit organization, which is not registered in charity. So the main implication is that if you're registered as a charity, you are under legal obligation in charities law to, do the reporting, provide comprehensive governance structure. So those are like legal obligations. However, if we do not do the charity route, if we do it by a nonprofit organization route, then those legal mandatory obligations do not apply, and you will have more flexibility. But at the same time, so you always want to also weigh in on, do you want your governance body of Lough Neagh to be subject to like legally mandatory requirements? And we can, of course, we can discuss this a little bit further because there are a lot of like details and subtleties over the governance of the company. And to refer back to option one, right? The management company only is binding by its contractual obligation to safeguard Lough Neagh. And so comparing with what option one can do, like the option two Rights of Nature Trust would be the governance body would be obliged to act in the best interest of Lough Neagh. So making it more similar to the legal guardian concept that Pooja has mentioned early on. And therefore, this might be this would be a model that with a little bit higher like enforceability and like element to it. So we can also move on to option three to see a bare trust model. So what do you mean by bare trust model? I would name it as a nature trusteeship model. So it is a option that grounded by trust law. So option one grounded by contract law, option two grounded by company law, and the third one is grounded by trust law, meaning that the current owner would declare a trust by way of transferring the legal title to a trustee. And then by declaring a trust, a trustee will be appointed to be the guardian of Lough Neagh. And because Lough Neagh does not have legal personhood, as in like it is not a legal person, so the idea is that we will incorporate a company to represent Lough Neagh, so that the Lough Neagh would be a beneficiary of the trust arrangement. So for this option, you can see some similarity between like option three and option two and option one, in the sense that the trustee in this bare trust option would also be a management company that's similar to the management company in option one and similar to the trust company, a charitable trust company in option two. So, however, because this option is grounded by trust law and trustee under UK trust law would be subject to really stringent fiduciary duties owed to the beneficiary. And in this case, the beneficiary would be in Lough Neagh, incorporate and represented by the company that we're going to form. So, and then for option three, it's about bear trust. But then there's also another variation of how this option could be done. So we can have, one trustee, which is more based on if Charlotte, if you go to the table with like different options of so yes. So you can have like a community development trust company acting as sole trustee. You can have a right of nature trust company as a sole trustee, or you can have a co-trustee model. But I'm not going to go into details here, but I just want to elaborate how fluid the options could be and the pathway can be. So what model would be possible. And it really depends on the community inputs about how the weighting of different like priorities are in the restoration and preservation of Lough Neagh. So lastly, I'm just going to go through another scenario that we have thought about. So these three options I mentioned just now involved a transfer of ownership to a new owner. However, if you transfer land, there might be some sort of administrative or tax implications. So we do not want that to be an obstacle to the success of this project. And therefore, we also want to talk about an option where the current owner will retain the title. However, it would just be a bare legal title, meaning that all these substantive rights and obligations attached to the ownership of the Lough Neagh will be transferred to a management company, either in the form of the contractual management company or a right of nature trust company, so that even though superficially, literally, the legal ownership remains, however, all the management and substantive right in relation to Lough Neagh would be owned in a real sense by the community. So this is just an option that we want to flag, but we appreciate the realities of the arrangement. So that would be a summary of all the corporate pathways.
Thank you, Kate. And Peter, you're welcome to, and by the way, brilliant. As you can see, corporate law really does allow for so many exciting, innovative things to occur, and you just need some creativity and ecocentric law training to think about what those might be. So thank you for all those. Peter, do you want to transition us to this next section, or should Paul and I just jump in?
Go ahead there, Grant and Paul. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Paul, I'll let you kick things off after I just give
Yeah,
a
sure.
briefest introduction. But we talked a lot about do we really like advocate for using some of these like creative trust tools, or is legislation that really recognizes through public law the rights and voices of the Lough the better pathway? We kind of just introduced the options here, and leave it to you to think about which one you think calls to you, but there are some pros and cons of the different approaches. And Paul, go ahead. Why don't you walk us through the legislative options and tell us what you think?
Yeah, so if you can go back to the previous slide, Charlotte. Thanks. So I guess this is really where some of the stuff I mentioned in my introduction about where rights of nature collides with politics really happens, because all of the different options that have just been outlined there can be done within the current legal framework, the current political framework, just by the owner of the lot choosing to take whichever one of those paths. That is amazing, because that gives that real freedom just to go and do this and not have to wait on political or other changes to happen. The downside of it is it can only, if you like, touch the elements that the current owner can. So we know that there are lots of ways that the Lough is currently being harmed that are completely outside of the responsibility or even ability of the owner to influence. And that really potentially calls for a wider legislative solution. So that could be conferring substantive rights on the Lough. So actually, for instance, making substantive changes over water quality or other issues that are affecting the Lough through legislation. Also, excitingly, it could, I think, as we heard in some of those options, a lot of it's through, so a lot of the ways through the current law are through using trusts, but actually there could be a legislative option to actually go even further and give the loch self-ownership, legal personhood, and a sort of statutory guardianship body. Now, we know that's legally possible because it was done with the Wanganui River Act in 2017 in New Zealand, very similar legal system to the UK. So we know that could be done here, and it's a matter of politics as to be whether it's achievable. Now, anywhere else, I would say that's probably not achievable at the moment to get such an act passed into law. But I do think that what is being proposed here for the loch is so innovative, so exciting, so able to inspire people that actually it could be used, this transfer of self-ownership of the loch could be used to unlock that legislative change. And there's a real possibility of that. So I think we want to keep that in mind. And it's also interesting to note that you could also mix and match these different options. So for instance, the current owner could transfer a lease of the loch for either a year or a decade or however long into one of the different options we've just seen. And then with a memorandum or even a legally encoded stipulation that full ownership, full freehold ownership will be transferred to the loch if and when there is a legislative intervention that gives substantive rights, legal personhood, all those things to the loch. So there is a lot of exciting different ways this can be done. And I'm very interested in it because for me, it's this sort of the real crucible between activism, campaigning, imagination, law, and politics. And it's just worth thinking of what all those different options could potentially be. Dave, if you want to finish up and add anything I missed there, Grant.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'll just add a couple last thoughts. What's exciting about a legislative approach is legally, the lake exists as a political actor, has guardians that speak as the lake in a very real legal sense, just like a child might have a legal guardian, let's say. And you can get pretty close to that with corporate law, trust law, but I think the legislative approach gives it just an extra weight. And also, you could imagine a future where Lough Neagh is consulted in governmental decisions or has a role in government in some way, and it does open up a lot of pathways. If you go down this approach, or really for any of the approaches, you can also ask yourself, what rights does Lough Neagh have? And I think that's a really great community process. There's different ways. Rights of nature legislation has defined nature's rights. In some cases, it's a right to exist, a right to thrive, a right to health, a right to be healthy. That makes a lot of sense. In other cases, if you want to really get into, what rights specifically does Lough Neagh have, apart from its general role as being part of nature, you can ask, what does Lough Neagh need to do or to have to fulfill its role in the larger community of life? And, things it might need to do is to perform its natural functions. It might need to have adequate, clean water and habitat for the biodiversity of life. And this is kind of a fun public process to explore to define these rights. And then lastly, for guardianship, this is just a great place to give voice to traditional stewards of Lough Neagh, those who are close culturally, bioculturally to the lake. And they can be representing Lough Neagh at large, or you can even create guardian seats for different elements of the ecosystem, different species, different life that exists in Lough Neagh. So lots of exciting possibilities here. Of course, it does require governmental buy-in. And as Paul said, and as Kate has said, there's a lot of fluidity between these approaches and possibility for creative pathways that grab a little bit from different places. And yeah, we're here to guide you through that journey. So thank you.
Thank you, Grant and Paul. We're now going to move to open up the conversation. We're inviting you to indicate in the chat if you have a question or an observation or critique. And please don't worry, that we're also asking you to commit your views in writing and to feedback to the panel so that when we move to the final publication, there'll be an opportunity to systematically incorporate and reflect your views. So this is just a first outing, if you like. So I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, who will invite you to make your comments. Thanks.
Sorry, I just had to pause my sharing. I hope that's been done for you all.
I think Declan's first there.
Yes, please, Declan, would you please?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte and Peter and all the speakers. I'm the Director of Equal Justice Ireland, and the purpose is to help facilitate a just transition of Irish society. And I work closely with local grassroots community activists. I also chair the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, and I'm the International Secretary for the Socialist Lawyers Association of Ireland. So the question was really addressing Grant's point about the exciting prospects of corporate law. The presentations have really failed to address the impact of colonialism and capitalism on this island. And I think there's no assumption that I would have that there's any legitimacy to the title that the current owner has to Lough Neagh. And I think that has to be recognized, or at least has to be articulated, because many of the groups that I work with consider the Earl of Shaftesbury and his predecessors to be thieves and have taken Lough Neagh illegitimately. And that's a view that I subscribe to. Now, that's not to say I'm, trying to prevent dialogue and discussion regarding this matter, but I really think that it behoves me, with the mission of my NGO, with my political beliefs as a socialist, to really question the way in which this is being framed and the potential to just name it, recognize it, and also recognize that corporate law is inherently a legal fiction and a creature of capitalist development, which has harmed Lough Neagh. So I'm open to discussions, to critiques, to responses, but some things have to be named, and the long reach of colonial plunder on this island is something that has to be named.
Thanks so much. Yeah, maybe I can start with a few points, and then other folks can chime in as they'd like. When you do rights of nature, ecocentric law campaigns, everyone I've ever worked with is entangled with colonialism. And, a lot of ways, some of these approaches are about disentangling colonialism. And corporate law, in and of itself, I feel like there is an ecocentric version of corporate law. Kind of one of my, things that I've been exploring in the space a lot is that, the whole legal system really is rooted in colonialism. And this comes up a lot of the times, especially when I'm working with indigenous partners in the Americas and in Africa and in Asia, where it's like, is more of this colonial legal structure the answer to the problems brought by this colonial legal structure? And I think the same question is brought up with, solutions rooted in capitalism. Is more capitalism somehow the solution to the problems caused by capitalism? And I think that's a fair point to explore. On the corporate law specifically, as I said, I do think there are ecocentric applications of corporate law where, corporate law is a space with a lot of legal fictions and a lot of, the idea that corporations have rights is a legal fiction, for example, and a lot of possibilities where within a corporate law space, you can kind of create your own like little legal universe that in some ways is separate and contained, which I think for the ecocentric law space opens up so many possibilities because it allows for a lot of creativity. But your point that it's rooted in colonialism is not lost in me. And I think, my answer to this normally is that we need to plan out a transition, a long-term transition outside of these colonial legal frameworks And you do also have to start somewhere. And the place you start somewhere, should not advance the problems that got you there. It should be in the right direction. But I think if you can, create one step towards this ecocentric, nature's voice and sovereignty approach, while charting out a long-term vision that might take a few steps, in some cases that works. As for the local politics, I won't comment so much on those, but yeah, I mean the point on colonial legal structures, I totally take to heart, and it's again something I see everywhere, and is fair. But I think this is a way we can start to address some of those issues, at least as my perspective. Does anyone want to add to that? I know that was a little bit vague, but hopefully.
With some trepidation, I feel like I might want to comment very briefly because I'm also a member of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers and also a fellow campaigner of Declan on many issues. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone has ever accused me of not being sufficiently radical in my quest to live my life and do everything I can for nature. And I caveat slightly because obviously I'm British and not Irish, so I don't want to get involved with a particular sting of colonialism on that island. But I would say that to me, there are obviously sins of the past which stretch into the present. But I think there is something very interesting in this process that people are trying to look to something different and to use the unpicking of those sins of the past to not only try and unpick what has happened before, but to actually put a visionary example of the way things that can do in the future. And for me, I think there is obviously a lot of reconciliation that has to happen, but what better way to do that than framing an incredible new way to relate to nature and to use that as an example to unpick the colonialist attitudes to nature that exist not just in Ireland but throughout the UK and indeed the world, and give an example to other people as to how they can unpick that relationship and use a new human way to relate to nature as part of that reconciliation. Is some of my thoughts. And I know that's quite vague, but also, yeah.
Thank you both so much. I think we have to go quickly to Rebecca now, if that's okay. She has to pop off soon.
Thanks. I've just let my next meeting know I might be a couple of minutes late, so hopefully I'll be here for the answer. So yeah, I'm really interested in the idea of whose voices are being heard in this conversation about the future of Lough Neagh. And in particular, I know one of the opening presentations was about democratic processes, but there wasn't a lot of detail on what kinds of democratic processes. And also, I think we need to acknowledge that the term democracy is actually kind of multifaceted and contested. And I'm interested in whether or not rights of nature has been used alongside mechanisms like citizens' assemblies or other kinds of deliberative processes. Are there examples of that elsewhere in the world? And how might that work here in Lough Neagh? And I know there's been conversations kind of floating around. I didn't introduce myself, so I'm head of Northern Ireland for Involve. So we're an organisation that specialises in deliberative democracy, including citizens' assemblies. And we've been approached by a few people who are curious about this as a potential part of the solution or a way of finding a solution that people can live with. And yeah, curious from the experts on this call, have they come across this as part of making decisions about rights of nature, and the kind of ongoing guardianship or stewardship of nature once that has happened? Thanks. I'm sorry for the convoluted question. There's so much I want to ask, and I'm trying to be concise, and it's backfiring.
So I can respond, Rebecca. I spoke about the democratic processes at the beginning. The quick answer to your question about has the rights of nature been accomplished through democratic processes? And the quick answer is yes. So the first rights of nature laws were grassroots local laws. I mean, it's from where the whole movement was built. It's been local communities at the grassroots who've had deliberative processes to explore what it means to recognize the rights of nature, what it needs to look like within their own community, and why they would pursue that pathway. So it was local communities having those discussions and making those decisions for themselves by adopting ordinances or bylaws. And the constitutional process that occurred in Ecuador was indeed by a deliberative process as well. People were elected to a set of delegates, a constituent assembly, including many indigenous delegates, to deliberate on the development of their constitution, the entire constitution, not just the rights of nature provisions. So that was a democratic process for that. And what we can envision here is true deliberative process within the communities of Northern Ireland. I believe that's something you're exploring, in which the people within the communities, much like we've done many, many workshops across Northern Ireland within communities, people exploring, what does this mean? What could this look like? What would our role be? How do we define that role? And we've often seen that process develop in a really strong way when people realize that they themselves do not have to be experts in law. I think that can be a real barrier to people's brains, but rather that they are experts in their community and with the ecosystems around which they live, and determining what those ecosystems and what those people who live there need and want to be healthy, to be resilient, and to be able to protect those things and restore those things. And then it's, lawyers who can help them to define literally what that needs to look like in law. But it's the people who have that conversation and say, this is what we need, this is what we want, this is our vision, let's create that. But that's a democratic process that can take place through discussions, workshops, convenings, local convenings over a real period of time. This is, I think, important to think of as a process, something that evolves, because it's not a one and done, and I don't think it can come from above. I think it needs to absolutely come from below, because it's what's happened above that's brought us to the state of the loch where it is. So that's what we would very much like to see. I think there's a real history of that within Northern Ireland, so much to build on there.
Thank you so much, Mari. And perhaps James wants to come in now with his question, which is also to do with legislation and democracy.
I really don't want to take too much of your time because I think Rebecca has pivoted to where I was trying to come from. In other words, I think the issue of democratic disenfranchisement around the loch has to be addressed before we develop these options any further. I think it's only right and fair that we identify what Lough Neagh is. It's not just the loch. It's an ecosystem, and I think we need to re-ecologize what we mean by the rights of nature in relation to Lough Neagh, both in terms of non-human kind and humankind. Yeah, the pollution, from human sewage, animal effluent has been identified, but there's so many other factors as well. So let's not get fixated on the loch as a line on a map in the weather forecast. So that's one point. And I think another point is what are the changes that should happen, that could happen, that needs to happen if the loch was afforded legal rights to own herself? What are we talking? What changes are we talking about? And again, I think that has to be part of a deliberative democratic process. So in terms of detail, I think we're lacking detail on what the legislative options are, and I do believe there's a collective local government possibility in terms of enacting new legislation. I am really ambitious about this country at the minute because, we went from a nascent petro state, over the last 10 years to having some of the most progressive policies around fossil fuels last December. That was missed by a lot of people. If anybody wants to know the details, I can let you in. So we will get there, but we won't get there by asking the government to do it. We'll do it by strategic campaigning and by initiatives like this. So I'm really, really hopeful. If there is a comment to make, is that Yeah, we've got a lot of detail on the corporate law options now. It's so legally dense, forgive me, I can't get my head around it yet. But wonderful that that's on paper. But maybe there needs to be other forms of detail emerging over the next month or two. One is what legislation would look like, what local government legislation could look like. And the final one is, and if somebody wants to comment on this, what would a democratic process look like? Because until we prefigure this, I think within the democratic deficit around Lough Neagh, and it's not just the Lough, I think we're missing here. Played everybody and the Peter and everybody else for like I wouldn't have believed that we were talking about this a year ago. So, whatever I've said has to be seen in the context that we've come an enormous distance, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond?
I'll just say maybe a quick response to that. Yeah, good point on the legislation. Very happy to explore that more. If it seemed like maybe the corporate approaches were in more depth, I think it's because they're more novel. It's something that hasn't really been done before to this level. Whereas the legislative approaches are a little more established. But I agree, let's explore those more. I think one of the tricky things will be looking at different layers of government and considering, what powers do different levels of government have to support the rights of Lough Neagh and how could they do that? One of the things I've found in general is that if there's different layers of government and some have more authority than others, one thing really any level of government can do is to commit to giving an ecosystem a voice. And that can be through a guardianship body or some other role where it formally is given a voice, really in any government. Generally speaking, there's nothing that prevents that from happening. So I think if I was like a city in the area and I'm like, I just want to do something now that feels real, like create a position to represent Lough Neagh in that city, for example, and then you can get into like guardianship and all sorts of other things that might be a little different than like a full-fledged like national personhood law that like what we saw in Spain with Mar Menor, but there are a lot of options there. So I think I'm hopeful we'll get some good feedback here of things that'd be interesting to folks, and we'll definitely follow up on that.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe we can now go to Mark on questions surrounding local communities and stakeholders.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to. I've wrote my little segment there. There's a lot of like ideas coming out. Obviously, there's touching a lot of different facets of this whole crisis in general. It's a broad problem and it needs a lot of solutions that come in different ways. I guess to start out, I think I need discussion. And I think this has been echoed a bit. I'm sorry, I am going to echo a bit what James was saying there. Discussions on what the management of the lock is going to look like. Having a call like this, where some of these things in terms of corporate models and such as went over, if it doesn't involve the local community and what they want to see, like if there's not some sort of mass engagement on that, it doesn't seem that you are really empowering a democratic outcome in what you're going to go for. What the fear I would have is, and I mentioned this in one of my later points, that you could have one of these bodies set up, you could have a stakeholder who perhaps is a member of the body that is able to frustrate attempts to actually, keep the lock in a good state long term. There is the term stakeholders used there. I'm a bit wary of that term when I see it because, to me, like the main stakeholder that you would have is your community, the various groups for that. Whereas once you have things like sand dredgers as a stakeholder or, various like agroeconomic firms that they are going to have their own interests, are they going to have as much as a seat at the table as the actual community themselves? There were some points being made earlier, I guess this is in reply to Mary, about looking to Northern Ireland in general as a model for something more democratic. I just find that a bit strange because it would seem to me that the political structures of Northern Ireland, sort of that settlement in general, that is something that we really wouldn't want because it has led to a significant amount of gridlock and actually dealing with this issue. Like, I know it's not just the ownership. People have mentioned pollution as a big factor. The ownership isn't directly dealing with that, but it is that deadlock, through DERA that we're not actually seeing. We're 2 years into this problem without many of the things needing to address it actually being dealt with. It just seems that if we're going to talk about democracy, we need to make sure that the people are being involved with the decisions that are being made. For instance, there's a lot of models being mentioned here that are involving the current owner deciding what way he's going to give it up. Why does he not let the community just decide what they want to do with that? Why is he not just sort of saying, I will give it to you, you decide what you want to do with it, rather than I might lease it to you for a certain amount of time, depending on what I think about that. So yeah, just are we going to continue the extractivist model? Capitalism was only mentioned by Declan, I believe, whereas we can all recognize that it is a capitalist mode of production that is leading us to these problems, that people don't have input into preventing this pollution that is happening. And I guess that's another worry. I actually didn't mention this. I'm all over the place. It's probably a bit hard to follow some of this, but it is good, obviously, to have rights of nature being discussed. But there are already environmental legislations in place in the north that aren't being enforced on a broad swathe of things, particularly to do with Lough Neagh. A lot of the people who are doing their pollutant is not actually, they're like the DERA and the NIE are just, they're aware of this stuff, but they don't actually take after the people. They don't even enforce some of the fines, basically. So we could put some great corporate or legal infrastructure in place, but is it actually going to be carried out to prevent this from happening long term? Who knows?
Actually, just thank you very much for your question. I actually, theoretically and philosophically, I agree with you. We're aligned. I would love to clarify a point about the label of corporate law. So I think there's a distinction to be made between corporate law and, profit-making law. Of course, we always assume that companies are there to make money, but, charities are also companies under the law. So when we say corporate law, we're basically trying to say, apology for the confusion, but for company law in this context, we're saying it could be charitable companies, it could be non-profit organization. For example, like Earth Law Center is also a company, but they're using corporate law, like company as a tool to safeguard rights of nature. So I personally see law and company law or trust law, what kind of law there is, as a tool to advance a meaningful cause. And right now we're talking about the cause is to preserve and protect Lough Neagh and to give the Lough Neagh treat Lough Neagh as part of a form of life, and to give the community a stake to manage and enjoy and protect the Lough Neagh. So in terms of how to incorporate democracy into this structure. So I think we can all imagine a trade association, right? A trade association can also be a company, and it can have a different classes of members, members who are, members from the employees, members representing different walks of life, a trade association or a charity could have different members, members who are also employees of a charity, or members safeguarding different, doing activities of different types that the charity cares about. So in this context, I envisage that a member could be, the local community, could be experts in the ecosystem of Lough Neagh and environmental experts, and it could be, cultural groups, and they could be different types of members of this company that would be a democratic platform for the community and different stakeholders to advance the cause of safeguarding Lough Neagh. So I think in this whole movement and campaign, to me, is non-profit making, and it's not the traditional sense of corporate law. So we can use company law as a tool to, advance this non-profit making cause of this movement. So just want to clarify this this concept.
Thank you so much, Kate. I wanted to also bring in Bernadette now, if she'd like to speak.
Thank you, and thank everybody for the presentations. Picking up, I think, on James' question, a number of other points. I think the first thing to say is that there have been a number of references to to a 2-year crisis. We don't have a 2-year crisis. We have a crisis going back much longer than that. And we have stakeholders and interest groups going back much longer than that, both in terms of restoration of the environment and ecology, the development of collective ownership, and the conversations between all those various stakeholders. They've been ongoing for the best part of 15 years, and campaigning has been ongoing for over 50. In fact, before the current owner, I believe, was born. So Lough Neagh is not a new phenomenon. It is it has now gathered the imagination of people because of the extent of the crisis. It's important, I think, to gather the whole context. And when the Development Trust network in Northern Ireland, we have a lot of development trusts in Northern Ireland, some of whom are charitable companies, for example, like STEP, from which I recently retired, and others like the Lough Neagh Development Trust, which is a development trust but not a charity, of which I'm currently a member. But I think we have to get the overall context and pieces of the puzzle together. Development Trusts Northern Ireland did a fair bit of that around the Future Search, which was held, I think, in I forget, but before the last executive fell. And then we have to, I think, understand where the different approaches, the rights of nature approach, the transformation of a human rights approach to include the rights of nature, where these various approaches interact that give us a framework to work in. And I think what people are looking at, and the point I'd like to make up, I don't think it invalidates what we are being told here, but we can't progress those until we begin to go back. You can't decide on the mechanism first. You can't decide on the basis of the administration and make recommendations on that if you don't know what the purpose of the administration is for. And the policy we would always have used in STEP is that you can't build an infrastructure that will successfully carry the weight of the work that has to be done if you haven't determined what the work to be done is and how it is to be done. And I think that does raise very valid questions that some of our presentations raised. And I'll try not to take time because I write this down for feedback. But I think if we're talking about the rights of Lough Neagh, then we have to know, in some sense, around what exactly the specific rights of Lough Neagh in the context are. What is the self-determination, as it were, of the future of Lough Neagh? If Lough Neagh was speaking with all of her voices, her historic anti-colonial voice, which does not actually simply relate to British colonialism, but to all human colonialism on this island of the rights of nature. Because we all have behaved in a colonial fashion to appropriate nature for our needs. That's what colonialism is. So with respect to the Earl of Shaftesbury, he's not the only colonialist at the table when it comes to the rights of nature. And we act in that way quite deliberately and consciously every day. So we have to clearly understand what we mean by the rights of Lough Neagh within the context of the rights of nature, both in terms of her historic and cultural voices, but also her determination for the future And that is voices. It's not a voice. It's not a guardian. It is a number of voices whose primary interest is the ecology of Lough Neagh itself. And then we have the secondary interest, which I think was referred to again at the very beginning, that when we speak of Lough Neagh, we're not simply speaking of the lough as a catchment area, but we are also speaking of the lough and the people whose lives are determined and shaped by the lough in many ways. So we have to get, as it were, at the start of it and go back to another, if you like, anti-colonial or anti-monarchist, really, historically, theory of republicanism. If you don't understand that within democratic and deliberate democratic processes, you end up with Trumpism. But we have to determine almost what are the principles by which we, in a new relationship with nature and Lough Neagh, wish to be self-governing and coexisting with the lough. So we have got to, first of all, set out what are the sets of principles for the future, almost as a constitution for our new understanding of our relationship with each other as human beings of all interests with the lough itself. And when we know the principles by which we want to coexist and co-govern and be governed, then we set out the principles of government, policy making, decision making, finance raising, the purpose of that and the expenditure of it, in much the same way any country would do. So to jump from the beginning to the end as to what the systems of governance, administration, management, and control are, is to put the cart before the horse. And the only reason we're doing that at this point is because of the momentum and pressure being created by what people see as a 2-year crisis period. The fact that it has focused our minds should not rush us into a final solution, or we will end up with an agreement like the Good Friday Agreement, which isn't half as good as it's cracked up to be. That's my contribution, and I will think about it very carefully and write it all down very carefully. But I think we are being driven by panic to come to urgent solutions that are not necessarily good solutions, and we should be very careful not to do that. Significant work and significant expertise exists in the community, and unless we have a deliberate and participative democratic process, which will take time to develop that holistic approach, we're just going to end up with another failed solution. And I would counsel against it. This cannot be short-term funding and Department of Agriculture panic driven. Not on my watch, folks. Not on my watch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. I think we had a question from Emma about the structural elements of the pathways of the corporate law models that we've set out, but I think Emma has left, so perhaps she could email us that question and we can get back to her. In that way, maybe we could turn now to Eliza.
Hi, thank you. My name's Eliza. I work for the Committee on the Administration of Justice. It's a human rights organization based in Belfast. Thank you so much for going through all of these various options. They are really interesting. They are a bit overwhelming. There's so much detail, and I would love to see more information about each of the various options, the pros and cons. I particularly things like you mentioned the tax implications of some of these options. One of the things that I don't think was mentioned, but I'm curious about is the liability of the Earl under various options. So, for example, will the lock be able to sue the Earl for damages under some options and not others, and kind of how that might work. Uh, I also was very happy to hear that James is optimistic about the possibility of legislative reform. He definitely has his finger on the pulse of this much more than I do. But I've just been quite nervous about that. I think legislative reform would be wonderful, but I'm conscious about the power here of the agriculture lobby, and so I'd like a little bit more information about how legislative reform would operate. Um, I also do agree with Mark. I have kind of an inherent skepticism of our enforcement bodies. A big part of my job is to try to pressure our enforcement bodies here to do their job effectively. And so I think it's important that whatever entity ends up representing Lough Neagh, that entity is able to be held to account independently in some form. And I think that should go beyond just having fiduciary responsibilities and, a duty to present annual reports and stuff like that. I think that there should be some form of independent accountability. That might be, for example, having the entity be designated under Section 75 or or something else. But particularly, we really operate in a very unique environment here where our government routinely collapses. And so we really need to prepare for different mechanisms of enforceability and accountability. And we need to be prepared for, as Mark said, people with bad intentions infiltrating or trying to infiltrate some sort of a stakeholder group or a group that's designed to promote Lough Neagh's best interests. And then I think the last thing I was going to say is I'm really curious to know, this may be more of a question for Peter, but I'm curious to know about how this, what is the next step in this process in terms of selecting these options. And I guess I'm curious to know who is the ultimate decision maker going to be for regarding the preferred pathway.
Maybe I can go ahead, Peter.
Oh, this is great. Maybe I'll just hit one or two quick things, then open it up. In terms of accountability and transparency, I totally agree with you. There are tools such as guardian ad litems of children where there's legal standards to ensure you're enforcing, quote, the best interest of a child, let's say, if you're a guardian for a child. And I agree in this case, it's really, really important if this advances with the guardianship model to have strong accountability to ensure guardians are acting in the, quote, best interest of the loch, were that to be the case. And I quickly just want to say that just so you know, I really see this report that we have as a menu of options, none of which we're necessarily saying like you should do, but here's what you can do. We really like put all of our minds into what are all the possibilities here. There's legislation, there's corporate law, there's trust, there's blended mechanisms, and we just tried to like say, look at this big world of things you can do. And I totally 1,000% agree. Like community conversation and dialogue, and let's not put the cart before the horse. So just to say, yeah, I agree with you. Look at these as ideas, a menu of ideas. And yeah, I'll stop there. Kate, were you going to say something that I think Peter?
Yes, just to explain a little bit about liability of current owners, which is the issue about like whether Lough Neagh can sue, but I think this question boils down to the issue of enforceability. And the reason why the options are based in trust law, company law, or any type of law is because we want to inject that mandatory legal enforceability into the commitment the managers or the owners are making to Lough Neagh. So that, for example, if a director of the management company breached their duty to protect Lough Neagh, there's definitely these scenarios that the director would be liable. And this type of legal enforceability and injects a high degree of accountability so that we can use law as a tool to protect Lough Neagh more effectively. Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of further points. When I was listening to Bernadette, I was reminded of a saying that Bio Akomolafi is very fond of. Times are urgent. It's time to slow down, and I think there's no attempt to try to rush. What we're trying to do in this process is to make a very modest contribution to showing that there are tools, but this is not necessarily the moment when the tools need to be picked up and looked at as if they're an exhaustive set of possibilities. As we've said in the document, actually, the draft, the law is just one part of this, and by no means is it the most important part. There is a question of democracy, deliberation, legitimacy, and responding to the extent, the depth, and the longevity of the crisis that is represented by the lock. It's also important to note that we are not the decision makers. We're making an offering to campaigners, activists, and the decision makers. And it's an invitation to just to look and see how others have gone about beginning to think about turning these ideas into mechanisms to give us some purchase on the idea of the rights of nature as something that can be translated into a set of practical, legal, and other measures. But as I say, we're mindful that there's a larger democratic issue and another set of questions to be resolved before we move to the implementation and exploration of the legal mechanisms. I think that's one other thing that might be useful to mention in this context is that we have incorporated and we've talked to a world authority on the commons, on the relationship between the commons, commoning, and the restoration of the commons and the rights of nature idea. These are both deeply relational forms. They invite a completely new way to think about how we belong and interact and identify and protect the landscape, the land, and the bodies of water. So there's an interesting. This implies a model that would sit somewhere between traditional public sector control and also resistance and opposition to the exposure of the lock in future to market or commodifying approaches to restore the notion of the commons as a nice way to actually move from that long history of enclosure and plantation, and an interesting way to think about a combination of ideas that would actually offer us something very, very challenging in terms of embedding new forms of belonging and mutual responsibility, which are essentially democratic issues. They're not just environmental issues. Thank you. Charlotte?
I can't see that there are any more questions. Would anyone else like to bring up a query or mention anything? Yes, sure. I see two hands raised. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it might be Paddy.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes,
Yes.
thank you. Yeah, sorry, I missed a bit there, but I just wanted to come in and speak as an Ecuadorian and as somebody with family. Most of my family still are in Ambato. And since the Rights to Nature legislation was enshrined in around 2008, even with that legislation in Ecuador, it is, there's been breaches. And of course, we can go down a whole pathway along that line. But the rights of nature was only brought by grassroots activists, indigenous activists, and people power. And the Yasuni El Choco Andino victories recently in Ecuador, which protected indigenous Ecuadorian land, was also only brought about by indigenous activists. And I think it's worth always remembering that it has to be bottom up and not top down, and how a big problem with the lock is the lack of transparency. For example, there was a meeting in Westminster there recently, which none of the local communities ever heard anything about, and activists didn't hear anything about. But when the news came out that there was a meeting about the future of Lough Neagh, and it was all men, and it was in Westminster, it didn't just sit right. So I think that it's hard to talk about rights to nature in those sort of contexts without thinking about what actually made it successful in Ecuador, and it was people power at the end of the day. So yeah, just those points that I wanted to make there. And sorry, I've got to run here.
Thank you so much. And can we bring in Liam as well? Liam would still like to speak.
I think Liam had to leave, Charlotte. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. And I think Mark has his hand raised as well.
Yeah, just wanted to make a point. There was a few things mentioned after I'd spoken, just making reference. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough. There has been a lot of long-term campaigning on Lough Neagh. I didn't mean to sort of cut out and say that that hadn't been the case. I guess just like when I mentioned 2 years, for instance, it seemed that was the most obvious, like the manifestation of these symptoms of the crisis were occurring. Not to say that there hadn't been any such before that or no symptoms before, but it was really seeing all those news headlines and being up at the lock and just the smell of it and everything that seemed within the last 2 years, and that was when it was really coming to the fore, particularly then in public consciousness. And some people have noted that there's obviously a rush that people are feeling that they want to see results out from, like they want to see something happening with Lough Neagh to like, fix some of these issues, and that there's probably some rightful worry in that that you don't want to be picking like a bad solution to those long-term issues. That's entirely fair. The ownership obviously is a complicated thing in that. I guess with some of the other factors less directly involving the ownership, in terms of like the pollutants that are going in, those do seem to be things that there could be immediate decisions taken on. You could stop some of this stuff at least for now, and you could have like, investigations to determine what is sustainable long term. So I would be a little bit careful sometimes with rhetoric about sort of chiding people for wanting to see solutions on things, because people can get demoralized when they see so much intransigence politically on so many things around them, and they're interested in being part of a campaign, to like a broad campaign that is going to like basically bring some sort of like change around to their like community where there's such a horrible thing happening. And so like it can be hard to get people motivated in a mass sense to get involved in things. So it is correct to sort of lay out like your long-term focus on what you're trying to achieve in the right way, but bring people on board for at least the medium-term things or short-term things that they can achieve in terms of the environment. I guess as well, like there is a large point here about like democracy, grassroots movements, and things like that. But I do think there is a contradiction in that, that this rhetoric and the fact that the current owner of the lock is on this call, And if there is a contradiction between us recognizing the need to bring the community on and that almost like a subtle asking, oh, you might give it up in this way or you might lease it in this way. Why don't you just give it up, basically?
Unless anyone wants to respond to that, might we go to Michael?
Okay. Hi, it's Jerry and Michael, Jerry and Michael's show. It's Jerry Darby here. I'm the manager of the Lough Neagh partnership. And we've been holding quite a lot of discussions with the Earl Shaftesbury, and also just in terms of the partnership itself. It's important to note that the partnership is a community-based organization. The vast majority of our board members are from community organizations. In fact, we've actually 2 representing community network associations as well. And then we've also got about a dozen elected representatives as well. So there's nothing more democratic and transparent than getting somebody to vote for you and then to come and sit on a body representing the people who did vote for you. So it's just important to get that point over. 2 things that are being done. It's important to remember in relation to the Heritage Lottery application, which is looking at the ownership issue. But the other important thing to remember, and this is going back to Bernadette's point, which was a very good point. Why would you be doing that? What's the point of it? What's the existential purpose of looking at the ownership issue? And from our perspective, the other thing that's being done is looking to put together a 10-year heritage resilience plan. So it's looking at the natural, built and cultural heritage of the Lough. And that's where we see certainly the rights of nature element coming in here. And if you go back to the ownership issue then, it's the income from that, and it's the potential resource from that asset, which is the most important thing, but not the money itself. The money is just a tool in relation to looking at addressing the environmental needs of the Lough, and we all know what they are in terms of water quality. But more importantly, nobody ever seems to talk that much about, but it's probably, in my opinion, a more serious issue, which is habitat and species loss around the Lough. And I just come from a meeting there now earlier on looking at the designations and how effective the designations have been on Lough Neagh, and have been pretty poor, because we all know, as I say, the amount of species and habitats that have been lost as well. Just on the issue of the Earl Shaftesbury, I think it's really an opportunity worth grasping. I take Peter's point and Bernadette's point as well. There's no point rushing it. And as far as I can see, I think there's still probably a 2-year time scale in terms of working out exactly what a resilience plan would look like, but also how the ownership would feed into that, and what due diligence has to happen, and legal issues and all the associated issues with that. But the starting point is that he has been minded to look at gifting the Lough, and that's a good positive thing to start with. Now, we can't all go, the issue of colonialism has been mentioned there. We can't go back and talk about the effects of colonialism if you wish, but in terms of the ownership, I see it as one thing and one thing only, and that is a mechanism to ensure that the status of the Lough remains favourable. It's just a technical term, but that the designations are a favourable status, which means that at least what you're trying to do is to stem the loss, to stop any further loss of habitats and species on the Lough. And again, when I say the Lough, I don't mean just the water. I mean the area around it and the catchments all the way up. And it's a cross border issue if you want to look at trying to find the solutions. It's very complicated. There's no easy solutions. You can come out and say simple issues and simple solutions, but it's not. It is complex. It has a complex history to it. But I think there is a great opportunity to work in partnership with people, and the Lough Neagh partnership actually sees itself as actually no longer existing. So our existential purpose is to look at the future and to set up some sort of new integrated management structure, incorporating DAERA. You can say DAERA off all you want, but ultimately they have the statutory responsibility for the law and the catchment. And so you do have to work, you have to make friends with your enemies. You have to not just preach to the converted, but try and convert new people and new partners that are out there. It was about trying to bring people together as much as you can and be accountable. Just on the issue of the Parliament, we connected with the local elected representative. Now he just happens to be a male. I can't decide that, nor he couldn't decide that either. But he is elected by the people of Mid Ulster, so he is democratic and he is very transparent. And he agreed to actually go over to the House of Parliament with a delegation to actually, and the purpose, I go back to Bernadette's question, what's the purpose of that? What was the point of that? The purpose was very simple, to actually ensure that there was cross-community support for the ownership of the law. An Ulster Unionist community were there, the Labour community was there, and just to clarify, there was female representation. Sarah Duffy, who was the mayor of ABC Council, the representative of the Irish Consul was there as well. Again, that was a lady, and we had female representation there as well. Now, remember, it was in the House of Commons as well, which you would think would also be a very democratic input into it, because there was other MPs there as well, and again, they're all elected. So I think it was a very positive thing, and it was good to see a cross-party, both Northern Ireland, but also cross-party within the UK government. And one of our goals was to look at working with the Good Friday Agreement groups, the East-West group and the North-South Council, Ministerhood Council as well. And that's something we want to follow up with. So in summary, I think it's a really positive thing. I think there's great opportunities to increase the protection of the law, and that's the ultimate goal. It's the protection of the species. And I really genuinely think, I've always said, it wasn't that long ago under Charles I, where he made it very clear human beings didn't have any rights. We didn't have any rights. And people fought to actually say, oh, yeah,
I think Jerry's link is frozen there, Charlotte, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's happened for me at my end too. Perhaps then we can, if Paul, did you still want to mention something? I saw your hand was raised.
No, I'm happy to give the floor to anyone else for the moment.
Sure. I suppose if there's anyone else, maybe I'll pass it back to you, Peter, to round up. But I want to thank.
I see Tommy has his hand up, who hasn't been noticed, whoever Tommy is.
Sure, then let's invite Tommy.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you for all the contributions. It's been very interesting to listen to. There's just I know like a lot of the contributions, a lot of the last couple of comments were quite how would I say, sort of zooming out. I just wanted to zoom in on one kind of query in terms of, just to go back to the speakers, and I guess just in terms of their expertise on rights of nature, are any of them aware of any kind of precedent, I guess, in terms of previous rights of nature developments that maybe could be useful sort of in terms of the current political and constitutional kind of arrangements that exist here at the minute? I mean, even just taking into account that the catchment is obviously straddles two different jurisdictions, I guess. Are there any previous examples of rights of nature developments in other parts of the world that can maybe serve as useful as a useful context, or that could be kind of informative or instructive in some way in terms of developing proposals for Lough Neagh, and any of the proposed pathways? How would they, I guess, maybe speak to some of that kind of complexity? I suppose is to take up what Paul was saying. I guess that's one of the number of examples in which the rights of nature would come up against some of the political and constitutional realities of the loch, I guess, and of the wider loch catchment. So I don't know whether anybody could speak to that.
I think, there's one. I mean, there's probably many. One that I think is a really interesting example and speaks to some of the issues that people have raised in this call. It's worth looking into the process that led to the passing of the Wanganui Act in New Zealand, the Wanganui River Act in New Zealand in 2017. That wasn't just randomly given by the New Zealand government. It basically arose from long-standing negotiations to form peace between the Maori people and the British Crown. And as part of that, the Maori demanded that their sacred river, the Wanganui, be given to them. And there was loggerheads because the Crown was saying, no, the river belongs to us. We can't just give it to someone else. And the Maori was saying, no, it belongs to us. And eventually it was realized that actually their conception of property was actually different. And that when the Maori was saying, give it to us, they didn't mean them in a Western sense like we do. They meant in a very different sense. And the compromise that was reached, and it wasn't perfect for either, because the Maori actually don't fully regard the way it's been done as ideally what they would want or matching their exact conception. But the compromise that was arrived at was self-ownership for the river. And I think it's incredibly interesting that as a way of coming to a compromise and healing a long-running wound resulting from colonialism, that they chose to go forward in a spirit of something new and to give self-ownership to the river. And there's maybe some lessons about that can be drawn from what is also a very long-running, as we've heard, seemingly intractable I don't say dispute, but disagreement, not only between humans over who should own the loch, but as Bernadette pointed to, how the colonialism that's happened against nature herself in the way that all humans have related to the loch. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from that Wanganui example and what led to it. And maybe we could potentially go into more depth about that and the lessons that can be drawn from not just what's resulted from it, which is amazing, but what led up from it and what that could teach us for Lough Neagh.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear and read more about that in due course. Cheers.
Thank you so much. I think I can't see that there are any more hands, although please correct me if I'm wrong. We'll pass back to Peter now.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thanks to everybody who has participated in what was a full spectrum conversation. I think that alone made the exercise more than worthwhile. I think we've heard such a diversity of views, and as we've said in the first paragraphs of the briefing, we're very mindful of the fact that law is one dimension of this conversation. There's a larger conversation, set of conversations, not least around the legitimacy, the democratic input that need to be taken forward as well. On Tommy's point, I think an interesting dimension of the rights of nature movement is that while we can draw lessons from other parts of the world, and indeed other parts of the world have already engaged with us on the island, they've made interventions in the Citizens' Assembly deliberations, for example, from Ecuador. it's nevertheless a constellation of uniquely local movements. Ultimately, each innovation has resonated or echoed with the particular constitutional moment, or in Colombia, the post-conflict moment. And I think our own possibilities will also reflect our own circumstances. We'll draw on lessons and the gifts of other people's insights, but we'll deliberate and come up with our own unique response to the lock. It is the lock that is convening us today, and it's the lock will have the final word. I'd like to thank a few people who were not able to participate in the call. I'm thinking of Jessy Kate Schlinger. I'd also like to thank my student Leonora Bell, our IT support Declan Coyle, and David Bollier, who is an expert in the Commons, who has also offered to work very closely with us in the next iteration of the brief. If you'd like to commit your questions, challenges, observations to writing, we'd be delighted to hear from you. I've given my email address in the chat. We'd like to move towards another version of the brief and publish that at Easter time, but reflecting on the comments today and any comments in writing that you'd like to contribute as well. It only remains for me now to thank everybody who presented today, and all of especially the pro bono contributions. I think we're all acting out of a passion for the earth, acting out of a very critical moment for the earth and ourselves. And I'd like to thank you and all the participants for your contributions, and they're very well received. And we go forward now with appreciation. Thank you.